Well, it's been about a year since the FCC voted to regulate the Internet as a public utility. Up next in the net neutrality saga, a discussion and vote on privacy rules for the Internet. Jim Halpert is a privacy and cybersecurity lawyer. Mr. Halpert, what exactly will they be discussing? What's the issue?
The issue is that for many years, the Federal Trade Commission was the entity responsible for enforcement of privacy on the Internet. And by virtue of the net neutrality order, the FCC has changed that because it's classified Internet access providers as common carriers, effectively, in order to put forward its net neutrality rules. And that creates a void where the FTC can no longer regulate that aspect, that one aspect, the Internet access provider or telecommunications service provider aspect of the business of Internet access providers. So there's now a rulemaking coming up where the FCC will decide what to put in place in lieu of, or perhaps replicating, the FTC's rules, but under the new FCC authority.
John Simpson of ConsumerWatchdog, do you support the fact that the Federal Communications Commission may do some rulemaking in this area?
Absolutely. I mean, they've got to do it under the law. Once they reclassified the ISPs or the broadband Internet access providers as common carriers, like the telephone company, that meant that their regulations had to apply, and there's specific privacy regulations that relate to the data that gets gathered over the network by the provider. So they have to do it. Now the question is, most of the rules that existed in the world of telephones. Now that they've extended by reclassification the situation to cover ISPs, they have to come up with rules that are appropriate to the world of the Internet, not just to telephones. And that's what this is about.
Jim Halpert, do you support this rulemaking process, and what should be in it?
I agree with John that there's confusion right now as to what privacy rules apply, and it makes sense for the FCC to move forward and describe what rules it's going to apply in greater detail. In terms of what should be in that rule, I think that's really the key question in which we'll be discussing today. There is considerable disagreement. One can take the view that the Internet ecosystem is one whole entity, that ISPs are a particular player in that, but fundamentally in the world of Internet advertising, for example, ISPs are a very small player in that market right now, and that there ought to be one set of rules. If a consumer has an Apple iPhone, they don't expect a different set of rules to apply to the Internet connection that they receive than would apply to the operating system that sees all the traffic going across that phone or any of the apps on the phone. So there's an argument for consistency, and John will present an argument for exceptionalism, I think.
Well, that's not exactly right. But one of the things to think about here is precisely what kind of regulatory authority does the Federal Trade Commission, did it have in the past? And the fact of the matter is about all they could do was under what's known as a Section 5 violation, which is an unfair and deceptive practice. And so that basically meant that if a company said they were doing something with your information in their privacy policy and turned around and did something different, then they could be retroactively hit some kind of a fine or something like that. That happened to Google, $22.5 million. They said they were not, they were honoring blocking third-party cookies, but were in fact hacking around them, cost them $22.5 million. It was retroactive. The FCC affirmatively now, under the fact that the communications law will cover them as as common carriers, they have to make rules. I mean, the FTC never had rules. They didn't have any rulemaking authority. It's all been about
Before we go any further here, gentlemen, let's bring Howard Buskirk into the conversation. He's the Executive Senior Editor at Communications Daily.
Jim, I wanted to ask you, first of all, what are the concerns of the ISPs in terms of where the FCC may be headed in this area? What would be your biggest concerns?
Well, and I'm not here representing any particular ISP. I have done a lot of work counseling clients in many different areas, including some ISP clients. But I think that the concern is that if one were to apply the current telecommunications privacy rules, which were developed in the context of the Telecom Reform Act of 1996, which was a world of telephony, the rules really do not work very well in a world of the Internet, where you have apps and you have Internet advertising companies, you've got operating systems. All these different players are involved in and collecting a certain amount of information and also involved in delivering services. So the broad concern would, from the ISPs would be that they would be discriminated against. On the one hand, they're required under the net neutrality order to carry all traffic that goes across their systems. They're regulated as a sort of common carrier and required to support all these different entities. And then they would be prohibited from participating in the Internet advertising marketplace, which they currently are very, very small players in. So the idea that they would have to carry the traffic but be unable themselves to obtain any sort of advertising revenue by virtue of information that they obtain by virtue of providing Internet access service strikes many of the ISPs as very unfair, and also really dealing with a tiny part of the Internet ecosystem that is not currently a major player in the world of advertising. So it's really that this would be irrational and discriminatory.
And aren't there some questions about how much data the ISPs actually would have to protect, and how much data in the changing ecosystem, how much data that they're responsible for?
Well,
right?
There's a study that just came out by the former privacy czar in the Clinton White House, Peter Swire, with some other colleagues of his at Georgia Tech, which showed that the majority of Internet traffic by the end of this year is going to be encrypted, so that all the content of those communications will not be visible to the ISP. On the other hand, an operating system provider would see that traffic